My name is Lukhona Mnguni. We've been working on this study since March this year. So I'm just going to share with you what we did and what we found out there and what it means. And I'll try to do that in the shortest time possible. And I think Alan has already started that conversation of what we did. So we went to Mbizana local municipality. We were interested in selecting a transect. That transect is 32 kilometers. So in March we went there for an exploratory visit, and we didn't know what we were in for. Funny enough, when I go home, I drive past Mbizana all the time because my hometown is in Flagstaff. But I'd never really taken the off-ramp and gone all the way to Nkandolo. And of course, the first thing that we saw there was the poor state of the monument that is dedicated to Oliver Reginald Tambo. And a few months ago, or last month, the Minister of Arts and Culture tweeted how the Garden of Remembrance looks like, and I had to call him out on Twitter with the real photos of how it looks. And that was the benefit of having gone there. And I'm hopeful that that will put enough pressure for them to actually fix it and sort it out. We then had a drive around Nkandolo village itself, noticed a few things in terms of clustering of houses, the changing profile of houses when you move from Nkandolo towards Ludege, towards the R61 into town of Mbizana. And that's when we decided that our 0 point will not be Mbizana town to Nkandolo, our 0 point will be Nkandolo to Mbizana town. And so we had we zoned that 32 kilometer transect into 5 different areas. And as Alain has said, we then had about 20 field workers, and we had 4 each per zone. And it was meant to be people that reside as close as possible to the communities that they were going to be investigating in, and collecting what came up eventually to 974 citizen surveys. And we did this in the space of about 3 days. And we wanted to also give meaning to municipality processes of trying to provide employment opportunities for young people. So the 20 came entirely from the municipal database, and there was an incentive for them to participate, and hopefully they also learned some research skills in the process. So we did this door-to-door, and it's a highly dense research approach. I mean, you probably will get about 1,000 surveys from the entire municipality, and someone will write a report on the life of the entire municipality. And we took almost 1,000 surveys from just a 32 kilometer transect. And the reason why we did that was because we wanted to illuminate as best as possible the life, the socio-economic life in that space, the demographies in that space, and the thinking of people in terms of local government perceptions and all of these other things. And instead of doing a municipality-wide research, we wanted to focus on a dedicated part, because of course it cuts through Ludege, where Oliver Tambo did part of his schooling, and where Nelson Mandela and Winnie Madikizela got married in the Ludege Methodist Mission Church. It's an important route, historically and otherwise, as Al has already mentioned. Of course, then, after having done the surveys, we came back to our offices, clean up the data, analyze the data, have a preliminary report, and we went back to the community to run focus groups. We had 2 venues where we met with citizens that had participated in the research, SMS them to invite them. It was a cold, rainy day when we went back there in August the 22nd. And there had just been some snow in the Engele Mountains, in actual fact. And so it was extremely unpleasant for people, but we still had a turnout of about plus minus 120 people in both sessions, so 60-60. And that people appreciated, because we had promised to come back, and at least, unlike some other people that make empty promises, we were applauded for having kept to our promise of going back to communities. Lastly, we had briefings with what we call visible leaders in society, 2 traditional leaders, 1 religious leader, 1 municipal leader, 2 business leaders, and we wanted to have a broad macro conversation about what do they think about the life of Mbizana and where Mbizana should go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you briefly, I'll talk to some of the graphs. They are in the Mbizana report. And what I'll do is just share with you what we have discovered about the life of citizens from the citizen survey. And then I'll briefly just touch on the main points that came out in the discussions with the leaders, and also what all this means and this type of research where it can probably lead to. The first was, of course, to get a demographic snapshot of the area. And most people were born in Mbizana or surrounding areas within the vicinity of Mbizana. The majority of people that we spoke to, and our approach was that we will talk to people that are 18 years and older. We didn't necessarily come into the house and say, who's the household owner? We want to talk to them. We just wanted a respondent. It was a citizen survey after all. It was not a survey of household heads or whatever. We wanted any citizen that we encounter, but the proviso was that you encounter them in the home, not on the street. And so majority of those that we interviewed were female. About 67% of our study was of female citizens. And at some point we realized that the education levels of our participants, a majority of them are without a matric certificate. So they'll have primary school attained or secondary school attained, and then some have a matric, and as you can see there, people who hold a certificate, a diploma and a degree are actually very much smaller. We'll talk about that later, but it probably shows the propensity of people who are educated to move out of small towns like these ones in search of opportunities. And I'm sure if I were to ask some people where they come from here, it would show that migration of educated people. Our age profile, it's quite a young municipality. Majority of the people are within what we call the working age population, especially between 18 and 60. And that talks to issues that, and because our surveys were partly during the week and partly on a weekend, we can probably say people are highly unemployed, but we'll see that as we go. Most people came from Mbizana, and the reason why they came from Mbizana is because in our research, 2 zones fell within Mbizana classically. So it was the inner city of Mbizana where the posh homes are in that town, the suburbia of Mbizana, and then we had another zone just about 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers out of the CBD, and that's where you'll find your low-cost housing in that area. And therefore, we already knew that our target was plus minus 400 interviews within Mbizana itself, and it's by no accident that majority of the respondents are from Mbizana. You'll find that peri-urban and R61 junction might be mixed up there depending where you found people and what some people viewed as peri-urban. Nkandolo and Lutege almost have similar type of numbers, but also again Lutege, there was a pet zone that was cross-cutting Nkandolo and Lutege, and that's how we probably ended up with more people from Lutege and Nkandolo. So that's just to give a picture of why one area seems a bit more representative than the other. Then we did a cluster analysis of the citizens that we found, and we came up with 3 clusters. And all the clusters, if you will see, have government grant at the top, and that's because 47% of the people that we actually interviewed rely on grants, government grants for income. Another 10% relies on pension, and that pension, part of it is government grants, and part of it are those people that worked either as teachers and other professionals that are earning some form of pension. Group 1, government grant, support from family. The family owns the home. The individual doesn't own land, so the individual that we spoke to. Secondary school education, as the level, the highest level of education. And they reside in Mbizana town. They are typically of the age of 18 to 24. Now you can already start to imagine that these are 18 to 24s. They haven't finished school. You might find that some of them are still in school at that age, but they rely on odd jobs as well after the family support and the government grant. But that already shows you there's probably a future plight going on there of 18 to 24-year-olds that might never finish school and their employment prospects will be hampered. Group 2, again, relied on government grant for income. The individual owns the home, individual doesn't own land, no education and primary education, those were the most prevalent responses, so no education and primary education is the highest level of education. They reside in Ludege and Ngandolo, typically, and they are between the ages of 45 and 64. So 2 age brackets, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, and they rely on crop cultivation as part of generation of livelihoods. Because our research approach, we also wanted to make sure that we don't only focus just on incomes, we also wanted to understand if unemployment is so rife, how do people get by? How do you live? How do you generate a livelihood? And of course, then we had group 3, government grant again, individual owns home, typically have a matric, they live in Mbizana, they are between the ages of 35 to 44, they are job seekers, and they also rely on odd jobs. And I think those odd jobs, probably some of them form part of the informal economies, and Dr. Peterson will talk to that. So these are the 3 groups, and in some areas, you'll just keep these groups in mind. In some parts, we will analyze access to services and other things according to these 3 typical groups. But as you can see, the picture is not rosy at all. If you have 45 to 54 within KZN and within Gauteng, and it could be for a variety of reasons which we did not delve into, but we just wanted to check. And when we asked how many of those people that have migrated still support your family in terms of remittances and all of that, again, remittances were not that high as we had thought they would be. So that probably is another area that we could try and understand much more in future. Home ownership, generally homes are typically self-owned by families or by individuals, but you get the sense that people say they do not own land, and they say that in their majority, and partly that's because of the communal system that you have, of course, in majority of the rural areas. So you have the right of use of the land while you occupy it, but you probably can't really say that you own the land because there's no title that commits you to that land. And of course, if something were to happen and your family perished, that land would probably be reallocated to another family that needs land and to build. So you had land ownership much more in the town, closer to the town, where people are ratepayers and all of this, and they're titled. What do people use the land for? Of course, majority don't own, but generally people, if they had access to land, they indicated that they'd use it to build a house, crop cultivation, and also household crops. So very few thought of using the land for business purposes. The income variables, already as indicated in terms of income sources, you see the meaning of the government grant in spaces like that. Odd jobs from time to time, and then some people depend on family. These are the 3 markers that really come quite high in terms of income sources. And this talks directly to the issue of employment. There's about the 65, 67% unemployment rate there in that transact that we did, and within the citizens that we interviewed. So I mean, I think that methodology delineation is important. So it was a citizen survey, we encountered citizens, and 67% of them were unemployed. Some are no longer job seeking, they have been demotivated, and of course I think this relates also to the Stats SA figures in terms of people no longer looking for work, who have been looking for some time and have now given up. Some people, majority, which was pleasing, they are still looking for jobs, but there aren't that many opportunities. Business environment, people's perception was that it's unfavorable. Some felt it's favorable, others didn't know, and some chose not to answer that. In terms of, we then took the household income density plot. I mean, if you were to work with means, the mean was about 1,400 and some change. So on average, households have 1,400 and some change per month, which is just above what personal incomes are. But when you do the density plot, you actually assist yourself to check where does the majority of people actually lie within that high figure. And you find that most households are actually earning well below 1,500, 1,700 per month to get by with those typical household sizes of 4 or 5 persons. Personal income density plot. Again, average you'll get about 1,200, but the real story from the data is that about 55% of the people earn less than 1,000 rands. And the median of incomes in that data was 740 rands, individual income per month. So 50% of your people definitely earn 740 rands and less a month. That's what we learned, and so when you read the report and you see the interquartile figure and also the mean, you will also appreciate, and I think we mentioned it there, that a few high income earners distort the picture, and that is why it's important to do that density plot so that you actually see that while the mean looks high, the actual reality is that over 65% of the people are earning less than 1,500 per month. And I think when we calculated it at some point across the entire transact, we found that a month, that entire transact, among those 974 people, they were making about 1,200,000 and something per month. It's not a lot of money. If you're looking at people that are probably representing households of 5,000 and some change people. Access to services overall, there's higher access to electricity, and as you would know, I mean, this is one of the speaking points for government in terms of how they've done with electrification of spaces, and this actually confirms that there's higher access to electricity, and it's the highest access that there is according to this radar plot. Otherwise, if you look at issues of sanitation, if you look at refuse, of course, refuse collection is much more in the urban center. There's no refuse collection in the rural areas. Police as well, because of the vastness of the rural area, you'll find that people in the CBD experience policing much more than people in the rural areas. Healthcare issues, people are not accessing health as much as they should be. At least you'd expect that people's access to healthcare, education, and electricity should be high. We then did overall access to services by education levels, and there was quite an interesting correlation. And as you can see, people with no education fall very short in terms of their access. People with primary school education also fall short, secondary school education also fall short. Matric, your access starts improving. With a certificate and a diploma, it improves. And with a degree, you have greater access. Of course, if you go back to the 3 groups clustering, I mean, it confirms one thing. The educated people do not live in the rural areas. They live in the urban centers where they'll access more services, policing, refuse collection, jobs, and all of these other things. And this is why we then did an access to services by education level overall. And primary school, that is the red line, you will see that most of their access is in the inner center of the radar plot, which means that lower access to almost all services. Where they compete the most seems to be on electricity, and that is typically because the electrification has happened quite rapidly in rural areas since 1994. Otherwise, if you look at the diploma graph, which is the orange, with the orange line, and you follow that, it's much more on the outer space it's much more in the outer space of the radar plot, which shows you that higher access. And interestingly, it has lower access to adult education, and typically you'd understand why, because they already hold a diploma and they probably do not need adult education services, and that is why you would see that they access that less. But more worryingly, if you follow the red line again on adult education, it's still in the inner, and these are people with primary school education, and you would expect that there are some means and ways to make sure that they can continue to improve their education levels with adult education, and that is literally still lacking. People with certificates seem to access better adult education, and that could be because of certain centers that cater, private centers within the town of Mbizana that cater for people to sort of do special trades. Not many centers like that, but it will allow you to do a computer certificate, it will allow you to do this and that small specialized thing. The people that access police the most are those with a diploma and a degree and a certificate. As you can see, there's a massive gap between them and those with a matric. And that in particular starts to show the connection between education levels and location. And this is what we did. Typically 78% of the people that hold degrees live in Mbizana. And if you look at that Mbizana column, most of the people majority of the people who are educated live in Mbizana. Those with a matric 56%, with a diploma 81%, certificate 69%, degree 78%, and less of the educated people live in Mbizana. And so that ties up the connection between spatial inequality, education inequality, probably digital divide, probably employment opportunities, probably even informal business, startups and all of that. So Ngandolo, where that's the home village of Oliver Tambo. Excuse my spelling there. Ngandolo there has less educated people, as you can see, degrees, certificates, diplomas, because you would expect that even though people are working from afar, some commute from their village to the schools where they teach, the hospitals and clinics where they nurse and all of these things. But you also realize that there isn't much of higher education levels beyond, typically beyond primary school, and that shows you the plight of the people there. Access by employment status. Employed people have a higher access to services. Students also have a higher access to services, and that's typically because some of the students live in these low-cost houses in town so that they can be closer to the good schools which are in town. And retired people or pensioners have less access, and you would imagine that the older you get, the more access you actually need to services. I mean, I remember in a fieldwork discussion, fieldworkers focus group that we had wrapping up the study, and one elderly was complaining that where they live, because there's a river and they just need a small bridge, but it isn't there. So when they are ill, irrespective of whether they have to be wheelbarrowed towards the next road where they can then be picked up by an ambulance. And of course, that's not an ambulance that's going to arrive within an hour, 2 hours after you've called it. Again, this is access by employment status to various things, and you will see there the people that are students, again, their access is to health, to police, to ECD, to electricity, to sanitation mostly, and not refuse, is quite high. And again, it's a location thing. The refuse one is also interesting, because if we then say these students, some of them reside in the peri-urban of Mbizana, which is the low-cost housing community. Another story that came was the municipality collects garbage from the posh homes, and then towards the hospital of Mbizana, just at there, and there's a low-cost housing community there, and they dump it there. And so over time, they don't have a proper dumping site. So over time, this garbage attracts flies, and very bad flies, almost your fly type of thing, stinging flies. And you find that kids there have rash and starting to develop wounds and all of these other things because of interaction with that type of environment. Another low-cost housing community that is close to the correctional services facility was complaining about a sanitation issue. The correctional services sanitation pipe burst or something, and it was never fixed. And so what the community did is to open trenches just to assist the waste to move along and away from them. But of course, I mean, when it rains, it washes up, it bulges up, it goes towards the homes and all of these things. Those are some of the stories that we took from on the ground. And of course, in our discussions with business and municipal leader, we picked up the issue that one of the biggest challenges that face rural towns is that they were not planned. So instead of sinking your stormwater drainage system, that was never done. And so what you then ended up with was a situation where you need to think after the fact, after people have settled. How do you do it? And one of the biggest cries in that town is that there is a need for water and sanitation to develop a stormwater drainage, thinking along the side of the future town of Mbizana as well. Okay, away from the socio-economic conditions, what do people want? What do they view as important? Blue and red, there's a correlation between what people think is urgent and of importance. Thanks all. I have a monitor, thank you. Employment stands out. Because unemployment is high, it is a no-brainer that the uppermost in people's minds will be that they want employment, and that they view this as urgent and important. So urgent areas, that's where people said they want government to intervene the most. After employment, it's healthcare and nutrition, water and sanitation, and education. So what is interesting there is that people are more focused on the material, or the things that have effect on their material conditions. And they, as we were picking up education levels as correlating to the type of services that you'd get, people are not making probably that connection, also because probably education is a long-term investment. I might be still going to school, and yes, I want education, but I also want to make sure that I've got water and proper sanitation. So those are some of the things that we got to. Just to share, I mean, when you run data this big, there are things that will come out, there are things that might not come out. One of the approaches that we had taken to this study was, in terms of services, what we call access, quality, and utility. And this triangle of analysis is important because people can have access to electricity, but they might not be able to afford it. So their utility of it is then decreased. If you also have access to electricity, but the quality thereof is not good. I mean, for example, if you went to government and said, is the water in Kandolo? They'll probably say, yeah, there is water. But the pump at the water station failed about 3-4 years ago. It was taken away for repairs, it was never returned. So on paper in Kandolo, there's probably water, but in reality there is no water because the pump is not working. It's not even a question of the dam is not full or whatever, as you have those problems in Cape Town. It's a question of where is the pump, because rain is quite plenty there. Actually, that's one of the things that we picked up. What things influence government or people's opinions on government? We found that interaction with police actually make people have a negative perception about government. It could be because of the laxity with which they respond to issues. It could be because of the manner in which they are treated when they go to report issues. But also the interesting thing is that policing is not actually a local government function, but it actually impacts governments, a cooperative model, where in real terms, people cannot make a disjuncture between what is within the national departments and what is within the local government. I mean, I'm hearing premiers now complaining about how much they do not have power over police in their provinces, and it's becoming a serious problem. But people look up to those leaders that are closer to them for all services, whether education, police, and these have nothing to do with local government in the classic sense. Of course, employment also has, unemployment or lack of work access also has an impact on how people view the government. Lastly, perception of municipality by group. Remember those groups, group 1, group 2, group 3. Group 2 has a lower perception that there is corruption in the municipality. And part of this could do with education levels of the people, access to information though, because remember, the further you're away from the center, the less information you have about the dealings. And to have access about corruption, you must probably have even access to knowledge about Auditor General reports, what they have been saying. I mean, they've improved in Mbizana insofar as that is concerned. I think they got a clean audit 2015, 2016, an unqualified audit in 2015, 2016 from adverse opinions in 2012, 2013 building up. So there's also that. The municipality is badly managed overall. Everybody seems to have consensus. Municipal finances are spent badly overall. Everybody seems to have consensus. Generally in the regions of 60 to 66%, people were dissatisfied with the performance of the municipality insofar as we asked them how the municipality is performing to the vision of that municipality. So this is the data. I'm hoping that for those that will still be here later on, we'll talk more of the substantive responses that we got from the leaders and from the focus groups when we do the panel on local agency in an age of patronage, because there's a lot that came there. But just to emphasize the point, the democratization project still has a long way to go in spaces like Mbizana Municipality. So if you were listening to Dr. Shudin and how he spoke about gatekeeping, I mean, literally when the mayor's aide called, it was 30 minutes before the time of the meeting, and she's like, the mayor just cancelled the meeting. I said, why? No, you didn't brief her properly. I said, what does that mean? No, you did not meet her personally, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I was like, okay, we'll fix it another day. It is important that we think on how to fix those relationships and how to grow and mend them, because this type of research, it's useless if it is going to be shelved and gather dust. What is important about this type of research is to start a meaningful conversation in those communities and say, these are the urgent things. I mean, we did an Imagine Mbizana when we took the preliminary data, and it was inspired by the Imagine Chicago initiative, which in Durban we adapted as Imagine Durban. You give citizens a space to actually form the picture of the city that they want. We got interesting insights in terms of what people think a future Mbizana should do in terms of employment. People are talking about factories, people are talking about school uniforms being done locally and people being taught how to sew and all of these things, because many people buy them from Durban and so on. People are talking about abattoirs because they've got a lot of sheep and cattle there and they grow quite easily. There is a rural economic development hub that was launched there. It has a capacity to run as a maize mill for 23 hours in a day. It currently runs at 8 hours a day. And it doesn't have its products in the shelves in the local market. You have to go to it, and it's out in the rural area. So you have to take a trip, and they only make maize meal of 5 kg, 10 kg. And people there, because that's a stable product, they buy it in 25 kgs and 30 kgs. So sometimes government tries to put things in place, but the vision is not bolstered by local realities and what it means to actually do something of that nature. So there's great potential, and I think we'll unpack some of those in the afternoon. Thank you.